Yeah, thank you so much, Dieter, for the introduction. I'm very happy to talk here about possible contributions of Kantian ethics to the moral debates of climate change. And my talk is inspired by Hans Jonas' criticism of Kant, which Jonas raised in Das Prinzip Verantwortung, the imperative of responsibility from 1979. And I'd like to defend Kant against some of the criticisms that were raised by Jonas. And I want to focus on one particular thesis in my talk. I'm going to call this thesis the thesis of follow-up duties in Kantian ethics. So Hans Jonas says that Kantian ethics was only concerned with the moral assessment of the interaction of simultaneously existing people. Therefore, as Jonas puts it, Kant does not consider the important perspective of precaution in ethics. However, if we look at the moral challenges of climate change, we have to consider precautionary action today in order to shape the future so that people, humans in the future, will not be morally harmed. My thesis against Jonas is that the perspective of precaution can still be developed in Kantian ethics. In Kant, precautionary measures which are morally, not technically required, can be justified by a way of an analytical instrumental reasoning. These duties can be seen, as I would like to call it, follow-up duties to fulfill direct moral duties. So first of all, we have to admit to Jonas that the perspective of precaution does indeed play only a minor role in Kantian ethics. And there are reasons for that. As Klaus Steigleder explains, Kant assumes in his ethical writings that we already know the more or the less what is morally right or wrong, and that we also know how to put this into action. According to Steigleder, Kant is less focusing on practice or practical knowledge about what exactly to do and how. Kant's aim was to demonstrate that we really must do the morally right thing for its own sake. However, if it comes to the moral challenges of climate change, we often do not know what to do exactly. For example, it is unclear what kind of global energy system would be feasible, effective, safe, and fair. A lot of knowledge is still missing here. So moral questions of climate change are, in my opinion, not so much motivational problems, as it is often discussed, but furthermore also problems of knowledge, how to act in advance and in precaution. For sure, we do know what is going to happen in the near future. For example, the IPCC explains the expected changes and events in the near future. These natural changes include the salinization of drinking water, regional impossibility of agriculture, flooding of settlements and land, warming of the oceans, an increase in natural disasters, and the extinction of several species. If such events are to be avoided or at least reduced, the main precautionary imperative is that the global agricultural, industrial, transport and energy systems must be decarbonized as quickly as possible. This is, as we all know, due to the reason that CO2 emissions are one of the main drivers of global warming. Uncontrollable and irreversible changes to natural environment on a global scale are realistically possible due to uncontrolled warming. I'm saying realistically possible, but not clear in detail, because firstly, these are future events about which we don't exactly know when they will occur. And secondly, because it involves causalities, event manifestations, and effects that are not fully epistemically proven, but they are expected. Therefore, with regard to the consequences of climate change, we know that negative impacts on the natural foundations of life will occur on a large scale. But we don't know for sure when, where, and to what extent exactly. Nevertheless, precautionary action is necessary now and today. This also includes seeking out the necessary knowledge of how to act efficiently, feasible, and fair. And therefore, this is why I mentioned this, climate change is a very difficult moral problem from both an epistemic and a normative point of view. Hans Jonas now believes that we can only justify moral obligations of ecological precaution if we start to fear for the upcoming catastrophe. He tries to prove the absolute value of the existence of humanity and nature as a whole. So he's shifting the focus in contrast to Kant. I don't think that Jonas' strategy is working. But with Kant, we can set up a different framework to deal with the challenges. We should not ask, like Jonas, whether there should be humans or not, but what their living conditions must be like. So this is similar to the perspective of Corinna and Gareth. I want to ask, what are the social and natural conditions to live a life in autonomy? And this is also necessary for humans in the future. So if, according to Kant, we know today that people's autonomy is morally relevant to the highest degree, then we can examine what belongs to the long-term, global, and future realization of autonomous lives and what we need to do accordingly. And I think this is the point where we can find a perspective of moral precaution in Kantian ethics. There are two passages in Kant's work where the perspective of precaution is morally relevant. The first passage concerns the indirect duty of preserving one's own happiness. As Kant puts it in the Groundworks, seine eigene Glückseligkeit sichern ist Pflicht, wenigstens indirekt. Das ist also ein Unterschied zu den anderen direkten Pflichten. Oh, sorry. It is a difference to the other direct duties. So to preserve one's happiness is an indirect duty, as he puts it. Here, Kant is considering a duty to be prudent and to take precautions for one's own good life and happiness, in order to preserve the ability to think morally and, in a sense, not be tempted if certain situations occur. I see Kant's reasoning at this point in the Groundworks as follows. First, moral action with respect for autonomy must be. Second, however, if I am hungry, in pain or poor or suffering, there is a high probability that I will find myself in a situation in which I could see myself forced to behave morally wrong and just to fight more for my survival. Third, I would say we have to avoid such situations, and I'm morally obliged to take precautions to prevent coming in such situations. Otherwise, I would face a contradiction to to the requirement to act morally as required by autonomy in the long run. This prudent concern for oneself is not directly a moral duty, but it is required in order to be able to carefully fulfill other moral duties in the long term. In this respect, the prudent self-care signifies a group of special duties which follow from the moral requirement to fulfill direct moral duties. And this is why I would like to call this group of duties follow-up duties, because they are duties that need to be followed to be able to carefully observe duties which are directly moral in the long run. And I think what I just said, reconstructing Kant, can be transferred from the ego-logical, from ego-I, from the ego-logical to the intersubjective concern for later generations of humans. So first, we can assume that humans will exist in the future, and they must be able to live a life as required by their autonomy. In order to maintain consistency and coherence in our moral actions, we must develop precautionary actions which must be done today with foresight to the possibility of autonomous lives in the future. Otherwise, we would contradict ourselves in an instrumental way, but this is not only a technical reason, this is like we would contradict ourselves while we try to efficiently act moral. So therefore it's not only a technical imperative, it's also morally normative. Yeah, this follow-up duty is at the same time, in my opinion, an epistemic duty that calls on us to do research and generate knowledge of how to act efficiently for foresight in the future. So, but with this argument I have just given, we partially exceeded Kant's own considerations, since autonomy and its social conditions were set by me here as a morally required goals, in order to also make maximizing considerations of how to achieve these goals. So this is not Kant itself, this is in the Kantian spirit. Try to dig deeper into it, what is hidden there. However, I think by talking about the indirect duty to preserve one's own happiness, Kant has indicated that maximizing considerations are morally relevant as well. I now turn to the second passage in Kant's work, where the perspective of precaution enters into moral philosophy. The passage is about the direct duty of helping or assisting others. This duty is an imperfect duty. This means the general duty does not determine what exactly needs to be done in the face of crisis or in the face of need. Kant says, if a person is in a situation of crisis or emergency, in German in Not, then we are obligated to help this person. Kant mentions a scope. The act of helping which is required has to end the state of crisis in such a way that no more crisis is produced elsewhere. It would be instrumentally wrong to end crisis by providing more crisis in another place. The subject addressed by the duty, therefore, also is obligated by a follow-up duty to determine what exactly needs to be done in order to help efficiently, because it should be avoided to produce more crisis in another spot. Determining the correct act of helping depends on many empirical conditions, such as available resources, division of labor, the feasibility and the competences of the actors involved. There are many aspects and criteria that need to be determined in an empirically and normatively mixed way of reasoning. Kant gives a hint. He says, you should define sub-maxims, Untermaximen. This means this is like general rules which need to be obeyed to help efficiently in certain situations of crisis and emergency. And I think here, at this point with the Untermaximen, here we can include precaution to ensure that people do not get into crisis. Because crisis should be avoided, crisis should end, therefore we also should take precautions to not bring people in the situations. In terms of duties to help others regarding the consequences of climate change, this means that there's also a lot of epistemic duties to conduct interdisciplinary research to identify the appropriate precautionary measures, since possible crisis for future humans needs to be prevented. Here, philosophical ethics requires empirical information and knowledge, as well as research into specific strategies for mitigating or adapting to climate change. Unfortunately, Kant's moral philosophy offers here no direct help to determine and to solve the special empirical questions, for example, also how we should deal with conflicting goals, because it's one of the main problems in climate ethics, that on the one hand you need to end global poverty, especially the poverty of energy and electricity, and on the other hand you want to produce this security by not using fossil fuels, which is, as far as we know, besides nuclear energy, the only very reliable and strong source to produce electricity. So there are many conflicting goals, and Kant did not, for sure, obviously, not go into them. But I think what we can take from Kant is his conceptual framework. For example, about guaranteeing autonomy and enabling its realization as a well-founded moral values. Because this is, we can know today, autonomy is important, and therefore also the social conditions to save autonomous lives are important. And I think we can combine with scenarios which we're dealing with in climate change, we can follow Kant, and also we can follow further the 2 points of precaution which we can find in Kant and develop them more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me, and for Philipp for his excellent paper. I have 6 objections, but I will only give you 3 if time permits at all. First one, the focus on precaution. So you're absolutely right. Kant doesn't seem to give much attention to that. He's much more concerned with the moral assessment of people living here and now at the same time. However, I think that there are some dynamical elements in Kant. I'll just cite 3 of them. One is the Endzweck unserer Gattung, which he mentions in the Anthropology, to cultivate, civilize, and moralize ourselves through education. That obviously requires intergenerational knowledge transfer, so history. Second, the Keim der Zwietracht, the seed of dissent, again in the Anthropology, our inclination to wickedness, which, however, like Goethe, he believes also has a positive aspect. He thinks it's the engine of our progress, of our moral progress, because it allows us to overcome inner and outer obstacles. And that, again, I think implies some sort of dynamics here, historical dynamics. And thirdly, of course, in the metaphysics of morals, his idea that to perceive ourselves and others as autonomous, we are implicitly committed to what he calls Menschheit überhaupt, homo noumenon, right? That itself is ahistorical, but precisely because it is ahistorical, it is applicable to all instances of history. So that also gives us a sort of commitment throughout all points of history to this important idea to him. So maybe there are some dynamical elements in Kant. Secondly, your very interesting idea of extending the ecological indirect duty to later generations. So I wonder what exactly is the logic here. So we have on the one hand the proposition, I have an indirect duty towards my happiness because I have a direct, perfect duty to be moral, right? We all agree as good Kantians on that, I hope. However, it's not quite clear how we can extend this in a totally analogous or parallel way to later generations. So the idea, I suppose, would be as follows. I have an indirect duty towards others' happiness because, and here I have just question marks, I'm not quite sure how this proposition is meant to be continued, because of course the prudence that you very nicely cite from the groundwork is a prudence just towards myself, given my own perfect duty, moral duty. Now, I wonder whether we can maybe replace or at least complement this with another idea taken from Kant, more precisely from his essay Das Ende aller Dinge from 1794, where he speaks very interestingly about the duty to benevolence, die Pflicht des Wohlwollens, and he applies that to the idea of mankind as such. And maybe that's something we need to talk about and negotiate, whether that would give us some sort of duties also towards future generations. The third point I'd like to mention is maybe the last one, is this idea of epistemic duties sounds a little bit dodgy to me. To my knowledge, maybe you're right, they exist. To my knowledge, he doesn't speak of them. Doesn't mean that they don't exist. I just wonder what this how exactly you are supposed to conceptually construe these epistemic duties. So is it the duty to, and what comes now, duty to inquire? That sounds to me too vague because the bus driver who drove me this morning, does he have an epistemic duty to acquire specialist climate change knowledge or knowledge of Kant's works? Probably not. What about a professor in philosophy? Does he have the duty to acquire climate change knowledge or climate science knowledge? What about the model logician? What about them? I mean, of course, we all know that they should stop doing logic and read Kant instead, but okay. So maybe it's too wide, but is it rather that the duty in question is the duty to acquire knowledge that, so propositional knowledge, so knowledge that, etc. This I find also problematic because it's not quite clear how I can formulate to myself this duty without already presupposing that I have the knowledge, I have the duty to acquire, if you see what I'm trying to say. So, and then it's vacuous, then the duty is vacuous because I already have the knowledge I'm supposed to have a duty to acquire. Yeah, I will leave it here because I have other things, but we can chat afterwards. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hello. First of all, I would like to thank Philipp Richter for his speech and for the opportunity to respond to it, my very first, by the way. The lecture made me question whether Kant's ethical framework can adequately address environmental issues like the climate change through the principle of precaution or the follow-up duties, at least as a basis on which to build nowadays. As we have just heard, with Kant we can justify the protection of the environment by referring to the living conditions of future generations. In this approach, nature has no intrinsic value. With human beings at the center of climate protection efforts, you presupposes two goals. First, control over nature for the benefit of people, and second, conservation of nature for long-term use by people. I think it's questionable whether each of those goals can be achieved. I have studied philosophy and biology, and I doubt that humans can ever actually control nature, and that this has happened in the past for the benefit of all people. A good example of this point is, as mentioned, the use of nuclear power. I also believe that conserving nature only for long-term use by humans is difficult to defend. By emphasizing the primacy of humans over nature, one remains with an anthropocentric framework which, however, may not justice to the current ecological challenges. Climate change affects not only humans, but also countless non-human entities and entire ecosystems. A purely anthropocentric view may not capture the broad moral obligations that could arise from the ecological crisis in which we currently find ourselves. Kant's ethics were developed at a time when knowledge of human dependence on natural ecosystems was still very limited. So nowadays we are much more aware of our dependence. For example, Albert Einstein warned, if the bees disappeared from the earth, mankind has only 4 years left to live. The bee should therefore be protected by humans. However, this is not so clear for other species. So we maybe could assume that any damage to any animal or plant or ecosystem will also harm humans at some point. So significantly that they can no longer live in autonomy or live a decent life. Therefore, we could greatly expand the principle of precaution and the follow-up duties. However, I don't think that was your vision, especially if such a project is considered as submission to nature, and this is, according to Kant, considered as absurd and immoral. If, as a Kantian, you want to practice environmental protection in a very practical way, you would first have to consider whether future generations actually be affected so badly that their autonomy is in danger. And secondly, you have to consider whether you are restricting yourself so much that you are submitting yourself to nature what is to avoid, which seems very impractical to me at the end of all. Thus, Kantian-based environmental ethics may face some kind of an absurd extension problem, but even if not, such an approach seems quite complex to implement. But perhaps you see it differently. We could talk about it in a moment.
Thank you so much for the very insightful comments, Frau Behrend and Edward. Thank you. I want to start with the latter, and you just made me think of a problem that I was maybe neglecting together with Kantian thoughts, because as I take your comment, it is not so easy to say in advance if this is what we are doing now, something that will hurt a special species in the future, which might also affect the autonomous lives of humans. So it's not so easy to see in advance what action will lead to what. But I take this also as another example of the knowledge problems we are facing if we're dealing with long-term events for the future. Yeah, but I would still claim that the humans or das Subjekt, the subject, is what is of moral value and nature comes second. But I take from you that it is not easy to decide what is connected with the subject and what is only nature, because it's a mixture of both. As you pointed out, if the bees die, then human might also follow, because there will be no working ecosystems anymore. So that's true, and this is I have to think about, because for Kantian thoughts at the first place, the vocabulary is easy to use, das Subjekt, and there's the nature. Yeah? But in fact, if we're dealing with practical knowledge, how to act, this is something which is only analytically true if we want to distinguish between things, but in fact it is not. So maybe the human body or the subject's body is much bigger, yeah, or it needs to be considered bigger, also with the microbacteria and everything around it. Okay, this is I take, thank you. And then I want to come back to Edward's very insightful points, and yeah, I also feel a little bit ashamed that I did not that I was not more precise about the epistemic duties, but I think this is actually something which is only first of all something which indicates a certain aim of action, yeah. But I'm with you. It's vague, but and I don't think if it's only if it's only knowing that, I think it's also knowing how involved, yeah. So the epistemic duty is for me, something which is a thick concept to point out that if it comes to act morally, also sometimes inquiry, planning, taking precautions where you not physically act in space and time, this is also part of following a duty. So this is I wanted to point out, but I'm totally agree with you, this needs to be developed further, especially since this is not something which Kant mentions. This is not a Kantian term, epistemic duty. This is something you can, for example, find in Hans Jonas. Hans Jonas says the most important thing if we consider precaution to sustain nature is that there's a duty to know. We have to develop and research for certain types of knowledge. Yeah. And I think in Kant I can find something similar, because if I commit myself to precautionary means against the moral harm of people due to climate change, I can not only say I'm fighting climate change, I have to be precise and say I'm doing this to achieve this, and then I will go further. So I have to be precise, and this is I also want to subsume under the epistemic duty. Yeah.